The stars had never seemed so cold to Captain Jake Morrison as he stood on the bridge of the UES Vengeance, watching the deep space scanners paint impossible readings across his screens. 3 months had passed since Lieutenant Amy Richardson first picked up the strange signals from beyond the outer rim, and now those signals were getting closer with each passing day. The Zephyrian Empire had ruled the galaxy for over 3,000 years, though humans had no way of knowing this as they prepared their defenses around Earth. Admiral Kael'vas commanded the Third Expansion Fleet from his massive flagship, the Eternal Dominion, as it glided through hyperspace toward what his scouts reported as another primitive world ripe for conquest. The crystalline hull of his ship caught starlight and bent it into beautiful patterns, a testament to technology that had made the Zephyrians masters of space and time itself. Jake Morrison had been a cargo pilot just 5 years earlier, running supplies between Earth and the Mars colonies when the first deep space monitoring station went online at Jupiter's L4 point. Amy Richardson was fresh out of the academy then, assigned to communications duty on what everyone thought would be the most boring job in the solar system. Nobody expected to actually find anything out there in the dark between stars. Certainly not an empire that had been watching Earth's radio signals for the past century. The Zephyrian ships moved like liquid mercury through space, their gravity drives bending reality around them as they approached the Sol system. Admiral Kael'vas studied the tactical displays showing the third planet from this system's star, noting the primitive chemical rockets and crude metal stations orbiting the world. His officers reported detecting no gravity manipulation technology, no exotic matter weapons, nothing but basic electromagnetic emissions and what appeared to be fusion reactors in their most advanced vessels. Back on Earth, the hastily assembled Defense Council struggled to comprehend what they were facing. The alien transmissions that Amy Richardson had decoded were simple and direct in their message, though the technology behind them suggested capabilities far beyond human understanding. The aliens could bend space around their ships, create localized gravity wells strong enough to crush asteroids, and travel faster than light through what their computers estimated were controlled tiers in space-time itself. Jake Morrison walked through the corridors of the Vengeance, the newest and largest ship in Earth's defense fleet, knowing that his crew of 200 souls might be all that stood between humanity and extinction. The ship was an experiment in human engineering, built around the principle that if you couldn't outthink your enemy, you could at least try to outfight them. Every available resource had gone into making the Vengeance, and her sister ships as tough and heavily armed as possible. The Zephyrian advance scouts reported back to Admiral Kael'vas with growing confusion as they observed the human preparations. Instead of attempting to flee or sending desperate diplomatic messages, the primitive species was actually forming battle lines. Their ships moved into aggressive formations, their weapon systems charging, their crews apparently preparing for a fight they could not possibly win. It was unprecedented in 3 millennia of conquest. Amy Richardson sat at her communications station aboard the monitoring post at Jupiter, her hands steady despite the fear that gnawed at her stomach. The alien signals were getting stronger, and her computers estimated that first contact would occur within hours rather than days. She had tried everything she could think of to establish meaningful communication, beyond the simple surrender demands the aliens kept broadcasting, but they seemed uninterested in anything resembling negotiation. Engineer Ben Cooper worked frantically in the Vengeance's reactor core, making final adjustments to systems that had never been tested under combat conditions. The ship's experimental gravitational dampening fields were supposed to protect them from the exotic weapons the aliens seemed to favor, but nobody really knew if human engineering could stand up to technology that had conquered countless worlds. All they could do was hope that 3,000 years of easy victories had made their enemies overconfident. The Eternal Dominion dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, followed by 47 ships of varying sizes, each one a masterpiece of Zephyrian engineering. Admiral Kael'vas expected the usual sequence of events: a demonstration of power, frantic attempts at communication from the primitives, and eventual surrender once they realized the futility of resistance. He had performed this same routine hundreds of times across dozens of star systems. Captain Jake Morrison received the proximity alarms with grim satisfaction as his sensor operators confirmed what they had all been dreading and anticipating. The aliens were here. their ships moving toward Earth with the casual confidence of a species that had never known defeat. The human fleet consisted of 31 vessels in total, including converted cargo haulers and mining ships pressed into military service alongside the handful of purpose-built warships like the Vengeance. The Zephyrian formation spread out as it approached, each ship taking position in a pattern that would allow maximum coverage of their gravity manipulation fields. Admiral Kael'vas had learned through long experience that most species surrendered once they witnessed the reality-bending power of Zephyrian technology. A few demonstrations of their ability to crush matter through controlled gravity, Wells usually convinced even the most stubborn primitives that resistance was pointless. Amy Richardson's voice cut through the tense silence on the Vengeance's bridge as she reported incoming communications from the alien fleet. The message was the same as before, transmitted in broken human languages that the aliens had apparently learned from intercepted broadcasts. Surrender now and be spared, resist, and face obliteration. Captain Morrison listened to the ultimatum and then gave the only order that made sense to him as both a human being and a military officer. The human fleet began its approach toward the alien formation, engines burning at maximum power, as they accelerated toward what everyone knew would be either humanity's finest hour or its final act. Jake Morrison watched his tactical display update with the positions of every ship under his command, knowing that most of these brave men and women would not survive the next few hours. But they were going to meet their fate head-on, because that was what humans did when faced with impossible odds. Admiral Kael'vas observed the approaching human vessels with something approaching admiration for their courage, even as he prepared to demonstrate why that courage was ultimately meaningless against superior technology. He gave the order for his ships to begin charging their gravity manipulation systems, ready to show these primitives exactly what 3,000 years of galactic dominance looked like when applied with surgical precision against an inferior enemy. The stage was set for humanity's first interstellar war, though neither side truly understood what they were about to unleash upon each other in the cold darkness between worlds. Admiral Kael'vas stood in the command center of the Eternal Dominion, his crystalline fingers dancing across holographic controls that regulated forces beyond human comprehension. The primitive vessels approaching his fleet moved with determination that puzzled him, their crude metal hulls reflecting starlight as they accelerated toward what should have been certain destruction. 3,000 years of conquest had taught him to expect fear from inferior species, not this reckless advance into battle. Captain Jake Morrison gripped the command chair of the Vengeance as his ship shuddered under maximum acceleration. Every rivet and weld tested by forces that pushed the vessel to its engineering limits. Around him, his crew worked with quiet efficiency born of months of desperate training and the knowledge that Earth's survival depended on their actions in the next few hours. Commander Lisa Torres stood at the weapons console, her hands steady as she prepared targeting solutions for weapons that had never been fired in anger. The Zephyrian ships began to glow with an eerie blue light as their gravity manipulation systems came online, space itself bending around their crystalline hulls in patterns that hurt human eyes to observe. Admiral Kael'vas selected the closest human vessel, a converted cargo hauler designated the UES Defiance, as the target for his first demonstration. The gravity generators on his flagship began to spin up, preparing to create a localized space-time distortion that would crush the primitive ship like an empty can. Engineer Ben Cooper monitored his readings from deep within the Vengeance, watching as exotic energies began to wash over the human fleet from the alien vessels. The gravitational dampening fields that human scientists had developed were holding for now, but readings showed forces building that would soon test every system on the ship. He called out status reports to the bridge, his voice calm despite the sweat beading on his forehead as he watched instruments register impossible values. The first alien attack came without warning as space around the Defiance began to compress, reality folding in on itself as Admiral Kael'vas demonstrated the power that had conquered 1,000 worlds. The human ship's hull groaned and buckled under forces that should have reduced it to a sphere of compressed metal and flesh, but somehow the vessel held together. Captain Morrison watched in amazement as his tactical display showed the Defiance not only surviving but continuing its attack. "Run toward the alien line, Admiral." Kael'vas stared at his instruments in disbelief, as the gravity well that should have destroyed the primitive vessel instead seemed to slide around it like water around a stone. His science officers reported readings that made no sense according to Zephyrian understanding of physics. The human ships appeared to be protected by some form of gravitational dampening field. But the technology required for such protection should have been far beyond the capabilities of a species still using chemical rockets. Commander Lisa Torres opened fire with the Vengeance's main batteries as the range closed to optimal distance, her targeting computers locking onto the massive alien flagship with weapons that represented the pinnacle of human military engineering. The railgun batteries discharged with thunderous roars that echoed through the ship's hull, accelerating tungsten projectiles to velocities that human scientists had only dreamed of achieving just decades earlier. The projectiles screamed across the void at significant fractions of light speed, simple metal slugs that carried no exotic technology or complex guidance systems. Admiral Kelvos watched them approach with casual dismissal, confident that his ship's gravity shields would deflect the primitive kinetic weapons as easily as they had deflected plasma bolts and particle beams from more advanced species. The elegant defensive systems that protected Zephyrian vessels were designed to handle any conceivable threat from inferior civilizations. The first tungsten slug punched through the Eternal Dominion shields as if they did not exist, its simple mass and velocity overwhelming defensive systems that had been perfected over millennia of warfare. The projectile tore through crystalline armor plating and buried itself deep in the ship's superstructure, causing damage alarms to shriek throughout the vessel. Admiral Kelvos felt his ship shudder under impacts that his technology should have easily prevented. Engineer Ben Cooper watched his instruments with growing excitement as the human weapons proved effective against alien defenses that had seemed invincible just moments before. The gravitational dampening fields were working better than anyone had dared hope, not only protecting human ships from exotic attacks, but apparently interfering with the enemy's ability to defend against conventional weapons. Years of theoretical research were proving their worth in the crucible of actual combat. The battle escalated as more human ships joined the attack, their combined firepower overwhelming Zephyrian point defenses that had never been designed to handle such primitive but effective weapons. Captain Morrison ordered his fleet to close range and maintain constant fire, trusting in human engineering and the courage of his crews to carry them through a fight that was rewriting the rules of galactic warfare. With every passing minute, Admiral Kelvos found himself in the unprecedented position of ordering evasive maneuvers as his fleet took damage from weapons he had dismissed as harmless toys. The gravity manipulation technology that made Zephyrian ships masters of space also made them predictable in their movements, following elegant curves through space that human gunners could anticipate and target. Raw kinetic force was proving superior to sophisticated defensive systems that had never been tested against such direct approaches. Amy Richardson monitored communications from her station aboard the monitoring post, recording alien transmissions that showed growing panic and confusion as the Zephyrian fleet found itself outfought by supposedly primitive human vessels. The elegant tactical doctrines that had conquered the galaxy were failing against opponents who simply pointed their weapons at targets and fired the largest projectiles they could accelerate to the highest possible velocities. The tide of battle turned decisively when Commander Lisa Torres scored a direct hit on the Eternal Dominion's gravity manipulation core, her railgun projectiles tearing through systems that had taken centuries to perfect. Admiral Kelvos watched in horror as his flagship began to lose power, its reality-bending capabilities flickering and failing as human weapons continued their relentless bombardment. The surviving Zephyrian vessels began to retreat toward the outer system, their formation broken and their confidence shattered by an enemy that had defeated advanced technology through the simple application of basic physics. Captain Morrison held his fire as the aliens withdrew, knowing that humanity had won its first victory in a war that would reshape the galaxy's understanding of strength and weakness. The aftermath of the battle left both sides struggling to comprehend what had just occurred, though for very different reasons that would soon echo across the stars. The news of Admiral Kelvos's defeat spread through Zephyrian space like wildfire, carried by quantum communicators that transmitted impossible reports to every corner of the Empire. Fleet Commander Zarthek received the transmission while overseeing training exercises in the Rigel sector, his crystalline features darkening as he processed information that challenged everything he understood about galactic warfare. A primitive species had defeated advanced Zephyrian technology, using weapons that their scientists considered obsolete. before their civilization had even achieved spaceflight. Captain Jake Morrison stood in the Situation Room deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, studying holographic displays that showed the damaged state of Earth's defenses after their unexpected victory. The battle had cost them 12 ships and nearly 3,000 lives, losses that humanity could barely afford with the alien empire's inevitable response approaching. Admiral Richardson, Amy's older sister who commanded Earth's orbital defenses, briefed him on the massive alien fleet that long-range sensors detected gathering at the edge of Zephyrian space. Fleet Commander Zarthek assembled the largest battle group in recent Zephyrian history, 200 ships of the line representing the accumulated might of a dozen conquered star systems. His flagship, the Cosmic Retribution, dwarfed even the massive Eternal Dominion that had limped back to base with tales of defeat at primitive hands. The crystalline vessel stretched for miles through space, its gravity manipulation systems powerful enough to tear moons from their orbits and reshape entire asteroid fields. Engineer Carla Wade worked tirelessly in the orbital construction yards above Earth, overseeing the deployment of humanity's most desperate gambit. The kinetic bombardment network consisted of thousands of tungsten rods, each one the size of a telephone pole, and positioned in carefully calculated orbits around the planet. The concept was brutally simple. If the aliens came close enough to threaten Earth directly, they would face a rain of metal moving at velocities that would make nuclear weapons seem gentle by comparison. The human fleet had grown to 30 vessels after emergency. Construction programs converted every available hull into a warship. But Admiral Morrison knew that numbers meant nothing against the force approaching from deep space. The Zephyrians were bringing enough firepower to sterilize entire worlds, their gravity manipulation technology capable of creating black holes and tearing apart the fabric of space itself. Conventional military wisdom suggested that humanity should surrender, while surrender was still possible. Fleet Commander Zarthek studied intelligence reports about human technology as his armada moved through hyperspace toward the Sol system, trying to understand how primitive kinetic weapons had penetrated Zephyrian defenses. His science officers proposed theories about gravitational dampening fields and exotic matter manipulation, but none of their explanations adequately accounted for the complete failure of technology that had proven invincible for 3 millennia. Dr. Frank Ellis worked around the clock in laboratories hidden beneath Luna's surface, analyzing fragments of Zephyrian technology recovered from the previous battle. The alien materials were beyond human understanding in their complexity, incorporating elements that existed only in theoretical physics textbooks and energy patterns that human instruments could barely detect. Yet for all their sophistication, the materials showed fundamental weaknesses when subjected to simple kinetic stress testing. The Zephyrian fleet dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, their crystalline hulls catching Earth's sunlight and refracting it into rainbow patterns that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Fleet Commander Zarthek deployed his vessels in a sphere around the inner solar system, gravity generators beginning to charge as he prepared to demonstrate the price of resistance to Zephyrian authority. No primitive species would be allowed to threaten the Empire's reputation for invincibility. Admiral Morrison watched the alien deployment from the bridge of the Vengeance, now upgraded with every weapon system that human ingenuity could devise in the months since first contact. The ship bristled with railgun batteries, missile launchers, and experimental energy weapons that pushed the boundaries of human engineering. Around him, his crew prepared for what everyone knew would be either humanity's greatest victory or its final battle. Engineer Carla Wade monitored the kinetic bombardment network from her control station in orbit, her fingers hovering over controls that would unleash devastation beyond anything humanity had ever contemplated. The tungsten rods waited in their carefully planned orbits, each one positioned to fall toward specific coordinates with mathematical precision. The aliens had superior technology, but they had made the mistake of coming within range of Earth's gravity well. Fleet Commander Zarthek opened the battle by demonstrating the full power of Zephyrian technology, his gravity generators creating spatial distortions that twisted light itself into impossible shapes. The attack should have torn the human fleet apart at the molecular level, reducing their primitive vessels to clouds of component atoms scattered across the solar system. Instead, the gravitational dampening fields that protected human ships held firm, deflecting forces that could reshape reality itself. The human response came as a wave of tungsten projectiles launched from every vessel in the fleet. Thousands of metal slugs accelerated to velocities that made them invisible to the naked eye. Fleet Commander Zarthek watched with growing alarm as his ship's elegant defensive systems proved useless against weapons that operated on principles his civilization had abandoned eons ago. The sophisticated gravity shields that protected Zephyrian vessels could deflect exotic energy, but could not stop simple matter moving at sufficient velocity. Carla Wade triggered the kinetic bombardment network as alien ships moved into optimal range, her computers calculating trajectories for tungsten rods that would fall from orbit like the wrath of ancient gods. The rods began their descent toward the Zephyrian fleet, each one gathering speed as Earth's gravity accelerated them toward velocities that would make their impact equivalent to tactical nuclear weapons. Simple physics became humanity's most devastating weapon. The battle reached its climax as thousands of tungsten projectiles struck the Zephyrian formation from multiple directions, overwhelming point defenses that had never been designed to handle such primitive but effective attacks. Fleet Commander Zarthek felt his flagship shudder under impacts that tore through crystalline armor like paper, systems that had taken centuries to perfect failing under the assault of weapons that any industrial civilization could manufacture. Admiral Morrison's voice cut across all communication frequencies as the alien fleet began to break apart under the relentless bombardment, his words carrying across space to every surviving Zephyrian vessel. You conquered worlds without effort because you forgot that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective. The emergency council session on Zephyr Prime had been called for the first time in over 800 years. Its crystalline chambers filled with representatives from species that had served the Empire faithfully since their own conquests generations ago. High Chancellor Veltar presided over the gathering with visible strain, his ancient features showing the weight of decisions that could determine the fate of galactic civilization as they knew it. The holographic displays surrounding the council chamber showed tactical analyses of both human victories, data that challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare and technology. Dr. Frank Ellis worked in the converted mining facility on Ceres, surrounded by alien artifacts that his team had been studying since the first battle with the Zephyrians. The crystalline fragments and exotic materials recovered from destroyed alien vessels revealed technology so advanced that human scientists could barely comprehend its basic operating principles. Yet these same materials had proven vulnerable to simple kinetic impacts. The contradiction fascinated Ellis as much as it confused him, suggesting that technological sophistication did not automatically translate to practical invincibility. The Veluthan Collective's representative, Ambassador Thylak, argued passionately for immediate negotiations with the humans before their inexplicable military successes encouraged other species to rebel against Zephyrian authority. Her people had been among the first to surrender to the Empire millennia ago, choosing submission over destruction when faced with the reality of Zephyrian power. Now she watched with growing alarm as the mathematical certainty of that power crumbled under assault from weapons that her own ancestors might have built. Lieutenant Emma Clark stood in the Tactical Planning Center beneath Luna's surface, studying three-dimensional battle simulations that attempted to predict Zephyrian responses to human weapons and strategies. The alien empire's reliance on gravity manipulation technology created predictable patterns in their ship movements and defensive deployments, patterns that human tacticians were learning to exploit with weapons that operated on entirely different principles. Her recommendations for future engagements focused on humanity's greatest advantage, the willingness to use simple solutions against complex problems. The Caraxian clan leaders demanded total war against the humans, their warrior culture unable to accept that primitive weapons could defeat technology that had conquered their own star systems. Through demonstration of absolute superiority, War Chief Grakthar had led Caraxian forces in dozens of campaigns for the Empire, his tactical genius helping to subdue rebellious species that thought they could resist Zephyrian authority. The idea that crude kinetic weapons could succeed where sophisticated military forces had failed struck. At the core of everything he believed about power and conquest, Admiral Jake Morrison reviewed fleet deployment reports in his command center, noting with satisfaction that human shipyards throughout the solar system were producing vessels at rates that would have been impossible before the alien threat forced humanity to mobilize every available resource. The new ships emerging from construction yards around Mars and the asteroid belt incorporated lessons learned from previous battles. Their designs optimized for the kind of brutal, direct combat that seemed to confuse alien tactical doctrine. High Chancellor Veltar studied intelligence reports about human industrial capacity with growing concern, realizing that the primitive species possessed manufacturing capabilities that could potentially outproduce the entire Zephyrian Empire, if given sufficient time to mobilize. The humans seemed to approach warfare with the same crude directness that characterized their weapons, converting civilian infrastructure to military production with an efficiency that spoke of long experience with large-scale conflict among their own kind. Dr. Frank Ellis made his breakthrough discovery while analyzing the quantum resonance patterns in Zephyrian hull materials, finding that the exotic crystalline structures that made alien ships nearly invulnerable to energy weapons also made them surprisingly brittle when subjected to rapid mechanical stress. The same properties that allowed Zephyrian vessels to manipulate gravity and bend space around them created structural weaknesses that kinetic weapons could exploit with devastating effectiveness. Lieutenant Emma Clark's tactical analysis revealed another crucial vulnerability in Zephyrian combat doctrine. Their ships could not maneuver effectively when their gravity manipulation systems were disrupted by concentrated electromagnetic pulses. Human vessels equipped with powerful radio transmitters could theoretically jam alien propulsion systems, leaving the sophisticated enemy ships helpless against conventional weapons. The discovery suggested new strategies that could multiply human advantages in future engagements. The debate on Zephyr Prime grew heated as different factions within the Empire proposed conflicting responses to the human threat, some calling for negotiation, while others demanded escalation to total warfare. Ambassador Thylak warned that failure to contain the human rebellion could inspire other subject species to test Zephyrian authority with their own primitive but potentially effective weapons. War Chief Grakthar countered that any sign of weakness would shatter the Empire's carefully maintained image of invincibility. Captain Jake Stevens received command of the new Super Dreadnought U.S. Retribution as it completed construction in the orbital yards above Earth, the massive vessel representing humanity's commitment to meeting alien threats with overwhelming force rather than sophisticated technology. The ship's main weapon was a mass driver capable of accelerating small asteroids to relativistic velocities, turning space debris into projectiles that could devastate entire fleets. The concept violated every principle of elegant warfare that advanced civilizations seemed to prefer. Engineer Pete Wilson supervised the installation of the Retribution's unconventional weapon systems, marveling at the brutal simplicity of designs that prioritized raw destructive power over technological sophistication. The mass driver represented the ultimate expression of human military philosophy. If conventional weapons could defeat advanced offenses, then larger conventional weapons could defeat even more advanced offenses. The engineering challenges were immense, but the underlying concept remained elegantly simple. High Chancellor Veltar reached his decision after days of debate and analysis, authorizing the deployment of the largest military force in Zephyrian history to crush the human rebellion before it could spread to other parts of the galaxy. Over 1,000 ships would converge on the Sol system, bringing weapons capable of destroying entire star systems if necessary. The Empire's survival depended on demonstrating that technological superiority would ultimately triumph over primitive resourcefulness. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine not only humanity's fate but the future structure of galactic civilization itself, as two completely different approaches to warfare prepared to test their fundamental assumptions against each other in the cold vacuum of space where only results mattered. The Centauri system had never witnessed anything like the massive fleet that emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation. Over 1,000 Zephyrian vessels representing the accumulated military might of an empire that had ruled the galaxy for 3 millennia. High Chancellor Veltar himself commanded the armada from the bridge of the reality's edge, a vessel so advanced that it could theoretically erase matter from existence by manipulating the fundamental forces that held atoms together. The crystalline ship spread across space in patterns that hurt human eyes to observe, their gravity manipulation systems already beginning to bend light and distort the fabric of reality itself. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Vengeance as humanity's combined naval forces took position to meet the largest alien fleet in recorded history, knowing that Earth's survival depended on the outcome of the battle about to unfold. The human fleet numbered barely 200 vessels, including converted cargo haulers and mining ships pressed into military service alongside purpose-built warships like Captain Jake Stevens's Super Dreadnought Retribution. Every ship carried weapons that represented humanity's commitment to simple, brutal effectiveness over technological sophistication. Captain Stevens felt the Retribution shudder as its massive mass driver began charging, the weapon system drawing power from fusion reactors that had been designed specifically to accelerate small asteroids to velocities approaching 10% of light speed. The engineering challenges had been immense, but the underlying concept remained elegantly simple. Take a chunk of rock and metal, accelerate it to relativistic speeds, and point it at whatever needed to be destroyed. No exotic technology, no complex targeting systems, just raw physics applied with absolute conviction. High Chancellor Veltar activated the reality warping generators that represented the pinnacle of Zephyrian technological achievement, devices that could theoretically unmake matter by disrupting the quantum fields that gave substance its existence. The weapons had never been used in actual combat, their power considered too dangerous for deployment against conventional enemies. But the human threat required responses that went beyond traditional warfare. The generators began to hum with energy that made nearby space shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer. Pavement. Engineer Pete Wilson monitored his instruments aboard the UES, defiance as exotic energies washed over the human fleet, watching displays that registered forces beyond anything in human experience. The gravitational dampening fields that protected human vessels were holding for now, but readings showed that the aliens were preparing to unleash weapons that operated on principles that human science barely understood. He called out status reports to his captain while preparing backup systems that might keep them alive for a few more minutes. The first reality warping pulse erupted from the Zephyrian flagship like a wave of distorted space, targeting the center of the human formation with energy that should have reduced entire ships to their component quantum particles. Admiral Morrison watched his tactical displays flicker and distort as the alien weapon reached toward his fleet, space itself seeming to twist and buckle under forces that challenged the basic laws of physics. The pulse struck the human vessels and simply dispersed, unable to target something as fundamentally simple as metal hulls held together by mechanical bonds. Captain Stevens fired the Retribution's main gun as the range closed to optimal distance, his targeting computers locking onto the massive alien flagship with a weapon that represented the ultimate expression of human military philosophy. The mass driver discharged with a roar that echoed through the ship's superstructure, sending a nickel-iron asteroid fragment screaming toward the Zephyrian command vessel at velocities that made it invisible to conventional sensors. No guidance system, no exotic warhead, just a chunk of space rock moving fast enough to punch through planets. High Chancellor Veltar watched the approaching projectile with growing alarm, as his science officers reported that their reality warping generators could not target something so simple and brutally direct. The quantum disruption fields that could unmake sophisticated matter simply passed through the primitive projectile without effect, unable to find purchase on something that existed as pure kinetic energy rather than complex technological systems. The asteroid fragment struck his flagship with the force of a small nuclear weapon, vaporizing entire sections of crystalline hull and creating shockwaves that disabled dozens of surrounding vessels. The battle exploded into chaos as both fleets engaged at close range, human weapons proving devastatingly effective against alien defenses that had been designed to counter sophisticated technology rather than primitive projectiles. Engineer Pete Wilson aboard the Defiance demonstrated humanity's greatest tactical advantage when Zephyrian ships began linking their gravity fields for protection, his solution as direct as it was unexpected. Chemical explosives packed with iron, shrapnel overwhelmed alien point defenses through sheer volume and unpredictability, Admiral Morrison coordinated. The human attack with tactical doctrine that emphasized concentration, of firepower over elegant maneuvering, his vessels closing to point-blank range, where their kinetic weapons could achieve maximum effectiveness. The Zephyrian formation began to collapse as ships that had conquered countless worlds found themselves outfought by weapons that any industrial civilization could manufacture. Crystalline hulls cracked under bombardment from tungsten projectiles. Gravity manipulation systems failed when subjected to electromagnetic interference from human radio transmitters. Captain Stevens reloaded his mass driver with another asteroid fragment as the Retribution continued its relentless advance through the alien formation, his crew working with mechanical precision to maintain a rate of fire that turned space debris into relativistic projectiles. Each shot represented years of human engineering effort, condensed into a single moment of devastating impact. Simple physics applied with the kind of determination that had carried humanity from caves to starships in just a few thousand years. High Chancellor Veltar realized with growing horror that his empire's technological superiority meant nothing against opponents who had weaponized the most basic principles of matter and energy. The reality-warping generators that should have been humanity's doom could not affect targets that operated below the threshold of quantum complexity, while gravity manipulation systems designed to bend space itself proved useless against projectiles that simply ignored exotic physics in favor of Newtonian mechanics. The Zephyrian surrender came not as a formal transmission, but as a gradual powering down of weapons across the alien fleet, surviving ships broadcasting emergency signals that Amy Richardson recognized as pleas for mercy in a dozen different languages. Admiral Morrison held his fire as alien vessels began to drift helplessly through space, their crews finally understanding that technological advancement without practical wisdom was merely elaborate vulnerability disguised as strength. High Chancellor Veltar's final transmission echoed across both fleets as the greatest military force in galactic history, acknowledged defeat at the hands of weapons that his ancestors might have built. We conquered worlds without effort because we forgot that true strength is not in avoiding struggle, but in embracing it with absolute conviction.